tonight. Our speaker is Erin. Can I ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself before you start?
Yes, I'm the archivist for Royal Agricultural.
Yep. So if you'd like to come up and you may have the stage.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's actually in my script to describe all this, so I can just kick straight into it if you like. Hello everyone, thanks for having me. Firstly, I'd like to say thanks to the Historical Society of South Australia for having me. Grateful to be able to share our collection with everyone, and I hope everyone gets something from the presentation. My name's Erin Reardon. I'm the Museum and Archives Coordinator at the Royal Agricultural and Horticultural Society of South Australia. Given how much of a mouthful that is, I'll refer to it as the RAHS, or the Society, from here on in. I'll also refer to the Royal Adelaide Show as the show from time to time. The first portion of this evening's presentation will look at the history of the RAHS and Showground and the significant place they hold in South Australian life. Given the 185-year history of the organisation, it'll be a brief overview, but it'll provide context for the second half of the presentation, where I'll be discussing our heritage collection and the challenges, successes and future of our collection. A bit about my background. My first career began as a cinema projectionist at the Mercury Cinema. In some ways this was my first heritage role. We screened archival 35mm prints using an old-fashioned two-projector system. The reason being that delicate archival prints couldn't be joined together in the way that commercial cinemas would do it. The films were quite fragile. We'd inspect and repair the films to avoid further damage as the prints went through the projectors. This role was also my first professional experience of the tension between preservation and the sharing of heritage. If preservation of a film is the only concern, you do not screen the film or you screen a digital copy if one exists. Often though, an audience wants to experience the original format to gain a stronger connection to the history of the film in much the same way museum patrons want to see an original object rather than a copy. After working as a projectionist for about 7 years, I did an arts degree at the University of Adelaide. I then did history honours before enrolling in a Master of Information Management at RMIT University in Melbourne. I began working at the RMIT Library soon after beginning the course, which was my first professional information management role. I was eager to get my career going and exited the master's course early with a graduate certificate. Over the next couple of years, I juggled casual work in a public and university library. My roles were varied, working on information desks, running technology classes and heritage library work, amongst other things. I landed a full-time role at RMIT in 2019, but when COVID hit, restructures quickly followed. I took a voluntary redundancy and came back to Adelaide in December of 2020. Shortly after arriving back in Adelaide, I worked as a library cataloguer, which is largely seasonal work based on the budgetary periods of the library clients that we serviced. I took on some cleaning work to tide me over when I saw an ad for a Museum and Archives Coordinator role at the RAHS at Adelaide Showground, which I was fortunate to get and began in June of 2022. The RAHS traces its lineage to the early years of South Australian colonisation, with an agricultural society forming in 1839. Prominent early colonists, such as David McLaren, the colonial manager of the South Australian Company, was the society's first president. The goal of the RAHS has essentially remained unchanged in 185 years, namely, for the promotion and success of South Australia's primary industry through the staging of events and the rewarding of excellence. A second agricultural society formed in 1842. By 1844, local newspapers served as a forum to debate which of the two societies was the society and whether the two should merge. This is an area of some historical confusion, as there was confusion at the time. Many members of the original society assumed a merger had already taken place. In 1846, formal agreement of a single entity was reached between the two organisations. The first show was held in December 1840 in the yards of Fordham's Hotel on Grenfell Street. The exhibits were limited to produce and included vegetables, cereals, cheese, wool and leather. In October 1843, the first livestock show was held at Payne's Hotel Yards in Hindley Street. In 1844, John Ridley, for whom the Ridley Gates and Ridley Centre at the showground are named, invented his revolutionary reaping machine and featured it in an exhibition. Local beer was also exhibited for the first time at this show. Since 1845, the Society has also run a wine competition. There are only 2 entries in the fledgling industry, one red and one white. I'd just like to read a bit from a newspaper report from the time reviewing the 2 wines. It was particularly scathing of the red wine, writing, 2 sorts of wine were shown, one which ought not to have been exhibited. It resembled the warm water with which a jar of currant jam had been washed. The reviewer was much less scathing of the white wine. Between 1846 and 1858, livestock shows were held at the Newmarket Hotel, although in 1852, the show was cancelled due to an exodus of South Australians crossing the border in search of riches in the goldfields. By 1860, the colony's first exhibition building was constructed in Botanic Park. In 1867, Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, visited the colony and opened the show, accepting the role of patron of the Society. 2 years later, Queen Victoria granted the Society its royal prefix. The wine show had grown from 2 entries in 1845 to 327 by 1871, prompting the Society to hold the wine show separately. In 1887, the Society held their spring show concurrently with the Adelaide Jubilee International Exhibition at what is now the northeastern corner of the University of Adelaide. The Jubilee Exhibition and Jubilee Oval would remain the site of the show until it moved to Wayville in 1925. The move from Jubilee to Wayville was a long and sometimes contentious process. More than 20 years earlier, the RAHS were aware the University of Adelaide was lobbying the state government to expand its boundaries. At the 1911 Royal Adelaide Show, Premier John Verron announced at the show's official luncheon that the state government had purchased 50 acres of land in Wayville for the Society. It was actually about 58 acres. The Society were offered a 99-year lease and given £30,000 for the relocation and loaned a further £40,000 for building and other costs. The lease was officially signed by the Society in 1913. Works on the site began in 1914, although the onset of World War I limited development. During the war, the dairy, cattle and sheep pavilions, which were completed between 1915 and 1917, were used as wheat and wool stores, with the showground also being used for the vocational training of returned soldiers. By 1920, work had recommenced on site, although it was estimated it would cost another £100,000 to complete. The Society suggested abandoning Wayville and staying on at Jubilee. The Society had years left on their lease, but this was untenable to the university and the state government. The government provided additional funds for construction and building, which intensified at the showground between 1922 and 1925. Finally, 12 years after signing a lease, the Society moved into their new home. Despite concerns the new showground was too far from the city, which is hard to believe now, the first show at Wayville was a resounding success, with record attendances and exhibitors. So much so that extra facilities were built for the 1926 show, including a second grandstand. In the following decade, more buildings were constructed, including Centennial Hall in 1936. Shortly after the show in 1939, the Army took possession of the showground after the outbreak of World War II. Due to the war, there were no shows held between 1940 and 1946, although interestingly, harness racing continued at the showground throughout this period. Around 3,000 troops were based at the showground at any one time, with the site being used as a recruit reception depot, with new soldiers receiving their initial training. The site performed many more functions than this, however. The current location of the REHS archive and museum was a hospital ward, and the old ram shed was used as an X-ray facility. There was no part of the showground that went unused by the military. The return show in 1947 reflected a deep need by the community to return to peacetime life. Barely a child under 10 would have any memory of the show, if they'd been at all. Such was the interest that on the Saturday, 144,000 people attended. Even accounting for interstate and overseas visitors, about 1 in 5 South Australians visited the show in a single day. As Rob Lynn notes in his fantastic book about the history of the REHS, which by the way I'm selling if anyone wants a copy after the talk, but as Rod notes, the Society made a rod for its own back with the success of the 1947 show. In the following years, exhibition demand outweighed the facilities. New pens and stalls were required, but with heavy competition for limited building materials from the housing industry and public sector, the Society had to make do. Attendances at the Royal Adelaide Show remained incredibly high throughout the following decades. The Society even began discussions to extend Centennial Hall and turn it into a 7,000-seat auditorium, although this never came to fruition. In 1978, the Dunstan government began plans to take over the showground and develop an exhibition, convention and entertainment precinct. Although the government assured the Society that nothing would proceed without their approval, although legal advice of the Society suggested that if the government wished, the Society could not prevent a takeover of the land. The press promoted an alternative vision of converting the Adelaide railway station for this purpose. The position of the press, public opinion and Dunstan's resignation in early 1979 dampened plans of a government takeover. In 1980, however, a group of developers consulted with the government about moving the showground to a former sewerage farm at Islington. And when that was ruled out, the Metropolitan Abattoirs at Jepps Cross. The land at Wayville was and is coveted by many, as it is by the Society, who quickly resisted a move. The initial 99-year lease of the showground by the REHS was due to lapse in 2012, but in 1998, the Society and the state government extended the lease for a further 50 years, taking the current arrangement to 2062. I'd now like to talk a bit about the significance of the Adelaide Showground as a year-round venue beyond its flagship event. In 1927, the first Speedway meets at Wayville were held, known as the Speedway Royale. Famous riders such as Harry Butler, Jack Chapman and Albie Taylor regularly featured on the front and back pages of newspapers. The biggest Speedway events at the showground attracted crowds exceeding 20,000, but by 1934, Speedway had finished its first run at Wayville. As popular as Speedway racing was, harness racing was bigger, and the track damage caused by the motorcycles meant finding an alternative venue. In 1986, after a 52-year absence, Mark Gilbert of Wayville Speedway Promotions convinced Unley Council and the REHS to allow Speedway at the showground once again. West End International Speedway events were held intermittently up until 2002. For 13 seasons from 1927, the West Adelaide Football Club made the showground their home ground. This was not the first time West Adelaide had shared a ground with the REHS, having played home games at Jubilee Oval between 1898 and 1906. West Adelaide's Wayville stint began on the 30th of April 1927, taking on the previous season's premiers Sturt. With their 1926 Magarey medal-winning captain coach Bruce McGregor at the helm, Westies were looking at a promising 1927. It couldn't have gotten off to a better start at the showground, with 11,000 people watching them beat Sturt by 2 points. The Bloods went on to win the flag that year, with McGregor winning back-to-back Magarey medals. an excellent beginning to a showground stint that ended with military occupation of the grounds in 1939. The Society could not escape being dragged into the intense rivalry between the SANFL and the South Australian Cricket Association, or SACA. In 1936, negotiations between the two came to a halt, with the SANFL going so far as to sign a contract to move all matches previously played at Adelaide Oval, including finals, to Wayville. The SANFL then used this agreement to negotiate better terms with Adelaide Oval and didn't go through with the move, although they were still required to honour the financial obligations of the contract they signed with the RAHS. In 1969, the SANFL approached the RAHS once again, although this time the proposal also involved a major stadium redevelopment. The Society declined the offer for fear of losing control and independence over the grounds. As history shows, the SANFL built football park at Westlake shortly after. One can only imagine how differently the following decades may have played out for the SANFL, SACA, Adelaide Oval and the RAHS had this proposal gone ahead. As mentioned, harness racing and speedway were not easy bedfellows, and so with the withdrawal of speedway in 1934, the South Australian Trotting Association made Wayville its home until 1973. Crowds for harness racing were regularly larger than the SANFL at the showground, with the Inter-Dominion of 1963 reportedly attracting a crowd of 47,000, well above the stated capacity of the main arena. South Australia became the epicentre of harness racing in Australia during this period, with the showground as its stage. The Forestville Eagles Basketball Club from the NBL 1 Central competition, the Premier State League, and feeder competition to the National Basketball League, have been based at the Wayville Sports Centre since 1999. After a recent redevelopment, the facility now features 7 courts and is home to Basketball SA, SA Country Basketball, SA Wheelchair Basketball and SA Church Basketball. Adelaide Lightning of the WNBL played their home games at Wayville from the early 2000s before moving to Adelaide Arena in Findon. Both the Lightning and Adelaide 36ers of the National Basketball League regularly train at Wayville today. Now I'd like to move on to the history of music at the showground, which is significant. The history of live music at the showground rivals that of any venue in South Australia. The list of acts who performed at Centennial Hall alone is a who's who of the biggest acts of the 20th century, including the Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, Suzi Quatro, the Easy Beats, the Monkees, the Who, the Kinks, the Beach Boys, Roy Orbison, Louis Armstrong, Nat King Cole, and one particularly big name which I'll get to in a moment. From the mid-1990s, the showground began playing host to music festivals. The Big Day Out was the biggest of these and was held 19 times at the showground between 1994 and 2013, with crowds of up to 40,000 seeing artists such as Metallica, Iggy Pop, Patti Smith, Foo Fighters, and hundreds more international and local acts. I'll now talk about the biggest band to ever play at the showground, and in fact the biggest band of all time. Centennial Hall was quite literally centre stage in the Beatles' visit to Adelaide. Their arrival led to an unprecedented outpouring of adulation that has probably never been matched since for any artist anywhere. Of the tens of thousands who attempted to get tickets, only 12,000 were available for the 4 shows played over 2 days at Centennial Hall. One of the interesting things about the Beatles' visit to Adelaide was that it almost didn't happen twice. A petition was required to have them added to the Australian tour, and once they were, a dispute between the RAHS and promoters regarding the cost to hire Centennial Hall threatened to derail everything. John Martins, who a lot of you know were a sponsor of the Beatles' visit, also acted as an intermediary between the society and promoters, and in the end, common sense prevailed. Many say Adelaide was never the same after the Beatles' visit, and without Centennial Hall, it's entirely possible that the Beatles would not have come. The Festival Centre and Apollo Stadium were yet to be built, and the PA systems the Beatles were using were inadequate for the indoor venues they were playing, let alone large outdoor venues. When Queen Elizabeth II became the first reigning monarch to visit South Australia in 1954, 97,000 school children put on a display for Her Majesty on the main arena. Apparently, the biggest cheer of the performance came when the school children were informed by the Minister for Education they'd received the following day off school. The next day, the Royal Music Festival was held for the Queen at the showground to a crowd of 60,000 and featured 2,000 performers. In 1959, the American evangelist Billy Graham held meetings on the main arena, the first of which reportedly attracted a crowd of 60,000. We've actually got a copy of this LP on the way to the archives right now. It cost about $2. We've already discussed the use of the showground by the military, but these aren't the only times the showground has been called upon in times of emergency. Christmas Day this year will mark the 50th anniversary of Cyclone Tracy devastating Darwin. RAHS staff, the Red Cross and the Salvation Army worked together using the showground for temporary accommodation and processing. Understandably, often the last thing on people's minds is collecting items for historical preservation in an emergency, and little evidence of this exists in our archives. Given the historical significance of Cyclone Tracy and the RAHS role in assisting those fleeing the disaster, I'm hopeful we might be able to collect some relevant items. Like the rest of the world, COVID-19 caused major disruptions to the RAHS, including the cancellation of the Royal Adelaide show in 2020 and 2021, the latter being cancelled just a few weeks out from the event. With SA Health advice limiting the show to 10,000 people a day, it was determined that going ahead at short notice would prove more costly than cancelling. Some competitions went ahead off-site, such as the Schools-led steer and Schools Merino sheep competitions, and some competitions were able to be held where the product was already on site, including grain, olives and olive oil, and beer and cider. Despite this, hundreds of thousands of people still passed through the showground during this time. Events such as Bowerbird and the Adelaide Farmers Market still operated throughout much of this period, but the biggest driver of traffic to the showground was the COVID-19 vaccination clinic. The clinic, opened for a little over a year, administered over 420,000 doses to the South Australian public, and although not covering for the loss of the show, provided sorely needed funds for the RAHS. I probably should have had a trigger warning at the beginning of this presentation, so I apologise. A visitor to the museum once told me how they ruined their exam paper by sweating all over it in the air-conditioned cauldron. In the book Memories of Centennial Hall, a contributor describes the venue as, and I quote, a symbol of educational torment. A considerable portion of the South Australian population performed this rite of passage at the showground, which continues to this day, albeit with air conditioning. Yeah. I did mine there. Yeah. So now talking about the RAHS Museum and Archive itself, its own history and functions. Until researching for this presentation, I assume the first attempts at formally celebrating the heritage of the RAHS began in the mid-80s. It turns out a museum was curated for the 1936 South Australian centenary celebrations. However, this collection of historical agricultural equipment and domestic items was found dilapidated under the sheep pavilion many years later. It'd be 50 years before a formal archive was established. In 1985, RAHS Director Gary Campbell tasked Jack Reardon with sorting through the contents located in the basement of Centennial Hall, where much of the current collection was stored. Jack initially thought it would take about 18 months to sort through, yet 14 years later, he was still on the job. Jack also wrote 2 history books for the RAHS, Teamwork, about the role of the RAHS in establishing the South Australian wine industry, and another titled The First Stripper, about the world's first successful mechanical grain harvesting machine and the historical dispute over whether John Ridley was indeed the inventor. Spoiler alert, Jack Reardon had no doubt that John Ridley was the inventor. I don't have an opinion on this either way. but the man who claimed Ridley stole the design from him was named John Bull. After Jack Reardon retired, Marilyn Ward was the archivist from 1999 to 2018. In 2006, Marilyn was given the mammoth task of moving the collection from the soon-to-be demolished Centennial Hall to its current location. Here, Marilyn curated the first permanent museum display. From the time Marilyn left in 2018 until I began the role in mid-2022, the archives were staffed very part-time and very intermittently. Lauren Gobbett worked in the role part-time and beyond the daily tasks, managed to expand the museum to its current size and establish the Show Museum website that we still use today. COVID disrupted the management of the collection as it disrupted life everywhere, and those tasked with maintaining the collection did an admirable job, especially given the limitations of time and resources. In the initial period from 1985 to 2018, the archive was staffed on average 4.5 days a week. From 2018 until mid-2022, staffing levels averaged less than a third of that. Heidi Ng, who some of you might know, spent 6 months working in the archives in the latter half of 2021. She worked a couple of days a week. Heidi did a lot of work on the finding aids, which has been a godsend for me. Some of the historical information I've used this evening has been drawn from research done by my predecessors. This is the current building that we're in now. This was originally known as the Elders Pavilion after the company that owned it. Elders owned the building from its construction in 1936 until transferring ownership to the REHS in 1999. The building has a floor space of about 200 square metres, of which 60% is used for the archives and about 40% for the museum. There's some items outside the building. The oldest minute books are in a safe room. Most of the trophy collection is in the Secretary's office. Many framed photographs and artworks are displayed in various locations, and some vintage items are in the old ram shed. A quick overview of the collection. We have about 170 archive boxes containing correspondence and other documents, about 800 framed photographs, artworks and certificates, 170 trophies and medals, 2,300 books, mostly herd books and agricultural journals, ranging from about 1848, 2,000 individual titles of Royal Adelaide Show publications, including competition catalogues, results, media guides, prize lists, programs, that kind of thing. We have about 85 photo albums and about 2,000 slides. As I said, minute books going back from 1856, and an AV collection including VHS, beta, DVDs, CDs and audio tapes. The museum itself contains timelines displaying the history of the REHS, the Royal Adelaide Show, the Royal Adelaide Wine Show, and displays about other events held at the showground, including the Beatles visit. There's also a small screening room where we show archival footage. We've got things like footage from the 1936 Royal Adelaide Show. Items on display include a Mad Mouse car, Dodgem car, vintage Laughing Clown, a miniature replica Ferris wheel. So I'll talk a little bit now about the structure that I work within. The RAHS Archives Foundation was registered as a charity in 2006 and has 7 board members. The foundation meets quarterly, and for each meeting I provide a report on what has been happening, plans and recommendations. The meetings are also attended by the RAHS CEO, CFO and Head of Strategy. 5 of the current Foundation board members are current or former executive board members of the RAHS, and everyone on the board has held esteemed positions in their various fields. This gives me the opportunity to advocate on behalf of the Heritage Collection to people of influence within the Society. My role as Museum and Archives Coordinator answers to the RAHS Head of Strategy, Mark McKay, who oversees the Education Foundation, Archives Foundation and capital works of the showground. When I began the role, there had not been an archivist in the building for 6 months. The only handover was from a staff member who, on top of their role in competitions, performed some admin tasks in the archive. The handover was less than a day. So on day one, I was standing alone in a building with tens of thousands of documents and objects, wondering where to begin. There has only ever been one person employed in the archives at a time, so when a person leaves, knowledge leaves with them. Furthermore, the strongest advocate for the collection is gone, meaning the collection can become out of sight, out of mind, especially when it is just one element within a larger organisation. When you add a global pandemic into the mix, the issue is further compounded. These periods of discontinuity meant processes and procedures were lost if not documented. The REHS archives had the remnants of a collection management system which was now inaccessible. Most of the documentation about the collection was contained in about 1,000 Word documents. Heidi's finding aids really were a godsend. I knew it was going to be a steep learning curve, and given the lack of a colleague in the archive, I would have to connect with peers in other collections. I joined the Australian Society of Archivists, where I was introduced to my Sydney equivalent from the RES New South Wales, which has since turned into regular video meetings with heritage staff from the Sydney, Melbourne and Perth Royal Societies. Our membership with the History Trust of South Australia required updating, so I did so and began connecting with them. Since then, we've also become a member of the Australian Museum and Galleries Association. I also connected with as many industry peers as I could find on LinkedIn. I reached out to numerous archivists asking if I could meet with them and see their collections. I reached out to Heidi Ying, who I hadn't met at that point, and she generously came into the archives and shared what information she could. Over the coming months, I visited numerous collections and museums and arranged online meetings with peers. Whilst it was valuable to see how other organisations arranged their collections, a reassuring lesson was discovering that all collections have their issues to varying degrees. Beforehand, I naively assumed that other collections were all perfectly arranged and it was just us that faced these problems. Having a background in libraries, it's a very different thing. Besides wrapping my head around the archival collection, one of my first tasks was to prepare the museum for the 2022 Royal Adelaide show. The display cabinets in the museum were about half full and had no screens on them. I wasn't even aware that we had screens for them until I stumbled across them one day. My first report to the Archives Foundation was in August of 2022, a few months after I started and a few weeks out from the show. My goal with this report was to present an honest appraisal of the challenges, but also offer potential solutions and hope. I identified what I saw as the major issues to be addressed, namely accessibility of the collection related to the lack of a functional collection management system, limited physical space, discontinuity in staffing, and the lack of connection between the collection and the outside world. In 2023, I presented the case for extra staffing in the archives, arguing it was necessary given the lack of resources over the previous 4 years. Furthermore, I wanted to work with someone who is an information management professional and who is directly invested in the collection. Claire Blore, who worked at both the History Trust and a church archive, worked with us 2 days a week for about 8 months. Claire and I set about establishing a collection management system and adding items to it, and documenting procedures and processes to try and help future-proof the collection. We scanned and digitised tens of thousands of pages of documents. Claire had more experience working in archival collections than I did, so it was a fantastic opportunity for me to learn off her. We've applied for and been fortunate to receive multiple grants in the last couple of years, the first of which was leftover money from a grant that Lauren had actually received for a large format printer. We used the remaining funds to buy 2 book scanners and began scanning and digitising show publications such as competition catalogues and competition results. The reason for this was because they can be used as a great family history resource. When you consider that every year there are about 20,000 competition entries at the show, that's a lot of names. These scans would then go onto the museum website. Since then, we've been fortunate to get many grants for preservation materials, and another that I'm not at liberty to talk about until the successful applicants are announced in the coming weeks, except to say it's the most significant grant we've received. A key focus since beginning the role was to try and increase public awareness in the collection, events like this being an example. Much of this has come through articles about our history, including a section called From the Archives that's included in the monthly e-newsletters that go out to the 2,500 society members. I've collaborated with Trove on a few occasions, one of which featured us on the homepage for a month, which was a bit of a thrill for me. I used Trove a lot as a student, and I still use it a lot now for work. It's an amazing resource, as I'm sure many of you know. Other examples have included writing articles for publications such as the Show magazine. I've begun doing radio interviews and appearing in videos over the last 6 months, well, I'll discuss further in a moment. Sometimes media interest finds you, which brings me to one of the more unusual, some might say downright ridiculous, but definitely most discussed items in our collection. The Beatles urinal. I should give a quick explanation. So this was the urinal that was in the green room of Centennial Hall and has since been known as the Beatles urinal. For some reason, this is one of the few items that was kept after the demolition, along with floorboards from the stage and street lamps from the Centennial Hall Goodwood Road entrance. For years, it was sitting in the roof above the basketball stadium, which also doubles as the dog pavilion during the show. The History Trust of South Australia were producing a video to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the Beatles' Adelaide visit and got in touch. We included other items in the video, but the Beatles urinal was given prominence by the filmmakers. This video was then seen by someone at ABC Radio, and they requested an interview. I thought I was going on to discuss the Beatles performing at the showground in general terms, but while I was waiting on the phone to do the interview and listening to the live broadcast, their talkback topic was the best public toilets in South Australia. You can guess what they wanted to discuss. I then received a request from Trove to write about our Beatles collection and this unusual item, then another from Insight magazine. The lesson here being that, as silly as an item might seem, if it gets people to engage with the history it represents, it's okay by me. One of the questions I've regularly been asked is, do you have proof the Beatles used it? To which my answer is, thankfully not. Occasionally, one is asked to look silly in the interests of promotion. There's a whole story behind this that I won't get into right now, but naturally, most media requests come around showtime. I've eased myself into this aspect of the job over the 3 shows I've now worked. In the first year, I only agreed to do pre-recorded interviews as the thought of going live filled me with dread when I had very limited historical knowledge of the REHS or the show. The second year, I reluctantly did one live interview on 5AA after much pressure, and this year I did multiple live interviews as I finally felt I had something to offer. I'm extremely fortunate I was given the freedom to take this gradual approach, which has allowed me to go out of my comfort zone at a manageable pace. This is our website. We've added about 40,000 pages of documents to the site so far, primarily for use as a record of the show and as a family history resource, but there's still plenty more to add. Before I began, there was already close to 1,000 images on the website. The website's still a work in progress, and we've got a lot of work to do to improve the searchability. But if anyone wants to go on it and have a look and they can't find what they're looking for, send me an email and I can always have a look. So the overwhelming majority of the engagement with the museum happens during the show. In my first show, we had just over 7,000 people through the doors, growing to about 11,000 this year. The REHS included the museum in its 2024 post-show survey of patrons, I believe for the first time, including questions around awareness of the museum, whether they visited the museum, and if they didn't, why, and what they would like to see in the museum. The overwhelming answer was that patrons wanted more videos, more displays, more interactive elements. This was music to my ears. It's difficult to share the history as broad as that of one that's 185 years old and which is featured so prominently in South Australian life in just 80 square metres. As a collecting archive, it continues to grow. Examples of recent acquisitions include a draft horse trophy from the 1875 show and a large collection of promotional Big Day Out posters. So next year, 2025, will be the centenary of the Society at Wayville. We're using this opportunity to launch history walking tours at the showground. These tours will help promote the heritage of the REHS and the Adelaide Showground and raise revenue for the Archives Foundation. We're still in the early stages of planning, but the idea is to launch these tours as part of the South Australian History Festival in May. Another goal for the centenary is to have all available Royal Adelaide Show competition results from the last 100 years on the website, which we've just about achieved. Now with scholarships, I can't go into too much detail as it's just an idea at this stage, but we're having discussions with one of the universities next week. Besides the obvious practical benefits for student and archive, engaging emerging professionals with the collection creates a pool of people who have experience with this specific collection in the event that I or someone else leaves, hopefully avoiding discontinuity in the management of the collection. It's also, of course, justifiable in its own terms, contributing to the development of emerging heritage professionals, wherever they end up in their careers. Of course, the best protection against discontinuity is to have more than one staff member working in the archive, but it doesn't have to be an either-or equation. In terms of collection management, the archives will never be finished. The backlog is large, and we continue to collect. At some point, we will need to migrate records from one system to another. However, the goal is to consistently improve the arrangement, description, and discoverability of the collection over time. As I alluded to earlier, I've been open about the fact I would love more space for the museum, the archives, and workspaces. There's no concrete plan to expand, although there are discussions around exhibiting items in other parts of the showground. We're looking to increase public engagement outside of showtime, and recently we've had aged care groups visiting the museum, but there's still massive room for growth in this area. History tours will form part of this, and eventually I would like to expand to school excursions, although a lot of planning and resources would be required to get that up and running. We do have some limitations given our location within the showground. We're separate from where most of the large events happen throughout the year. For example, if something like caravan and camping is on, we're actually fenced off, so we can't really capitalise on those sort of events. Obviously, there is a lot of stakeholders at the REHS and the showground, many of whom would also like a more central location and more space. Now, in terms of things that I would do differently and lessons learned, I mean, there's a lot of things. There's been a lot of trial and error. But one of the things I would recommend to any heritage organisation is to look into applying for a community heritage grant as early as possible. Community heritage grants are funded by the federal government and the major collecting institutions like the National Library, National Archives, National Film and Sound Archive, and the National Museum. These grants happen in 3 stages. The first stage is funding for an independent heritage professional to perform a significance assessment of your collection and write a report. The second stage is funding for a preservation needs assessment, and the third stage is funding for preservation work based on the outcomes of the preservation needs report. Overall, it's up to $20,000 of funding, but beyond that, it provides your organisation with an independent and nationally recognised report promoting the significance of your collection to those who might need convincing and can help underpin future grant opportunities. If anyone here is involved in any heritage organisations and wants to chat about these grants, I'm happy to pass on my details and have a chat about it. Now, the REHS role in some of the successes we're having in the museum and archives. I'm in a very privileged position where I've been given the freedom to think creatively. In the early days, I would literally go into the museum and spend hours wandering around, looking at the collection, and as the title of this presentation says, wondering what to do with it. Whilst this might seem unproductive, it was entirely necessary. You can't force answers to difficult questions without thinking carefully about how to deal with the collection. There's no more wandering around wondering what to do anymore. That's not to suggest I have all the answers, but I'm getting busier and busier all the time. To finish up, I'm an emerging professional with plenty still to learn, but I think my best achievement so far has been the importance and value of our heritage collection to the future of the whole organisation it represents. In the simplest terms, people will protect heritage that A, they are aware of, and B, they value. I've been very fortunate to work in an organisation that sees the merits in this and is providing the resources and support that will hopefully ensure the collection continues for at least another 185 years. Thank you.